December 19, 1944. The fate of the entire war in Europe hangs by a thread in a freezing room in Verdun, France, where Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and General George S. Patton are staring into the abyss of a catastrophe that should never have happened. While the world believes this meeting is simply a reaction to the sudden German onslaught in the Ardennes, Patton knows the terrifying truth. This is not a surprise attack, but the inevitable, bloody price of a single strategic mistake made by Allied leadership 4 months ago. To understand why American boys are currently dying in the snow, surrounded and outgunned, we cannot look at the maps of December. We must rewind to the blinding heat of August, where victory was in our grasp, only to be thrown away. 3 days before this grim conference on December 16th, the German army, a force dismissed by intelligence as broken and defeated, launched a massive counteroffensive with 250,000 men and 1,000 tanks, shattering the quiet American lines. This is the Battle of the Bulge, a nightmare of freezing foxholes and desperate survival. But for General Patton, the man they call Old Blood and Guts, this horror is a vindication of his darkest warnings. As he looks around the table at the shocked commanders, his mind is not just on the tactical emergency, but on the fatal decision made in late summer that gifted Adolf Hitler the time, space, and resources to rebuild his war machine from the ashes. The tragedy began in the euphoric days of August 1944, when the Allied breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, had succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of the war planners. German forces in France were not merely retreating, they were disintegrating, fleeing in a chaotic rout that signaled the total collapse of the Wehrmacht in the West. Leading the charge was Patton's Third Army, a relentless mechanical beast that moved so fast headquarters could not update their situation maps quickly enough to keep track of their own troops. Patton's tanks were tearing through the French countryside, capturing towns before the German garrisons even realized they were under attack, creating a momentum that paralyzed the enemy command structure. By late August, Patton's forces had reached the Moselle River, standing just 100 miles from the Rhine, the last natural barrier protecting the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. Beyond that river lay the Ruhr Valley, the engine of the enemy's war production, and Patton knew with absolute certainty that the German army was finished, incapable of defending the border if he simply kept pushing. The intelligence on his desk confirmed it. The enemy in the West was shattered, their logistics were non-existent, and their morale was broken. This was the critical moment. The fleeing enemy was disorganized, and the road to Berlin lay open to a commander bold enough to seize it, offering the tantalizing possibility of ending the war by Christmas 1944. Then came the order that would haunt the history books. On August 23rd, Supreme Commander Eisenhower made the decision to abandon the strategy of a single, lethal thrust into Germany in favor of a broad front advance. Instead of channeling all available fuel and supplies to the army with the momentum, Patton's Third Army, Eisenhower chose to spread the resources thinly across all Allied armies, ordering them to advance together in a methodical line. The reasoning was cautious and politically safe, designed to protect flanks and keep all coalition partners involved. But it ignored the brutal reality of logistics. The Allied supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and there simply wasn't enough gasoline for everyone to attack at once. Yet Eisenhower refused to gamble on a knockout blow. To make matters worse, priority for fuel was given to Field Marshal Montgomery's risky Market Garden operation in the north, a massive airborne gamble to capture bridges in Holland. This decision effectively strangled Patton's Third Army, forcing the most dangerous offensive force the Allies possessed to halt in its tracks, just as it was about to deliver the death blow. The meeting where Patton learned of this halt became legendary, with Old Blood and Guts raging against the dying of the light, demanding the fuel to finish the job. "Give me the gasoline," he told the brass, "and I'll be in Germany in 2 days and across the Rhine in a week." But the cautious planners shook their heads, worried about supply lines and flanks, ignoring Patton's argument that every day they sat consolidating was a day the Germans used to reorganize. Patton shot back that they were choosing safety over victory, screaming that they had the enemy beaten right now, but if they gave them time, they would pay for it in blood. Patton's fury was based on 3 strategic truths that were being ignored. First, the window of opportunity was closing fast. The German disorganization was temporary, and given a reprieve, the enemy would inevitably recover, dig in, and turn a rout into a war of attrition. Second, logistics favor concentration. Instead of giving 3 armies enough fuel to move slowly, you give one army enough fuel to move decisively and destroy the enemy's capacity to fight. A fast-moving army living off captured supplies and sheer momentum could achieve more than 3 sluggish armies tied to a rigid supply chain. Third, Patton was thinking strategically about ending the war, while Eisenhower was thinking tactically about managing the coalition and avoiding local setbacks. Patton famously declared he would rather have a German division behind him than a month of slow advance ahead of him, understanding that speed was the ultimate weapon. But the decision stood, and the fuel went north to Montgomery, leaving Patton's tanks dry and silent, while the shattered German units across the river began to breathe again. Patton wrote in his diary that this was the biggest mistake of the war, a prediction that would soon be written in the blood of the soldiers now shivering in the Ardennes. The consequences of the August halt did not manifest immediately in a single cataclysmic explosion, but rather arrived with the slow, grinding agony of a missed opportunity that gradually turned into a slaughter. While General George S. Patton sat fuming in his command tent, watching his fuel gauges hover near empty, Field Marshal Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden in September 1944, a daring gamble that consumed the precious supplies stripped from Patton's Third Army. The result was exactly what Patton had bitterly predicted in his diary, a spectacular failure where British paratroopers were surrounded and destroyed at Arnhem, wasting thousands of elite lives in crucial weeks of good weather on a bridge too far. As the wreckage of the airborne divisions smoked in Holland, a far more dangerous transformation was taking place along the German border, where the enemy was using the quiet gifted to them by the Allied pause to perform a miracle of their own. The shattered, fleeing German units that Patton could have overrun in August were now digging deep into the earth, manning the formidable Siegfried Line fortifications that had stood empty just weeks before. The concrete bunkers and pillboxes, once devoid of ammunition and soldiers, were now bristling with machine guns and fresh divisions, turning what should have been a mobile breakthrough into a meat grinder. October and November brought the rains, turning the battlefields of Lorraine into sucking mud that bogged down tanks and froze the marrow of infantrymen, forcing the Americans to fight for every yard of ground against a resurrected enemy. The statistics were damning. Positions that the Third Army could have walked through in late summer now required heavy artillery and thousands of casualties to capture, confirming Patton's warning that the Allies were paying for time with blood. Deep within the secretive command bunkers of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler was personally overseeing a plan that relied entirely on the breathing room Eisenhower's broad front strategy had provided. Codenamed Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, the plan involved secretly assembling a massive armored fist to smash through the weak American lines in the Ardennes, an operation that would have been logistically impossible had Patton been rampaging through the German rear areas in September. Patton's intelligence officers, aggressive and paranoid, began to detect the subtle tremors of this buildup, picking up radio intercepts and movement reports that suggested something massive was gathering in the forests. They sent urgent warnings up the chain of command, screaming that the quiet sector in the Ardennes was a trap, but the higher headquarters, lulled into complacency by the belief that Germany was finished, dismissed these reports as the jittery nerves of an over-aggressive army. Then came the dawn of December 16th, when the sky fell on the American defenders. Under the cover of heavy fog that grounded Allied air power, over 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks erupted from the tree line, smashing into units that were exhausted and spread thin. The chaos was total. American communications collapsed, command posts were overrun, and thousands of soldiers were captured in the opening hours as the German panzers drove a massive wedge, the Bulge, deep into Allied territory. This brings us back to that smoke-filled room in Verdun on December 19th, where the full weight of the August mistake was now crushing the air out of the room. The psychological tension in that room was suffocating, as Eisenhower looked not like a triumphant conqueror, but like a man carrying the weight of every cross in a military cemetery. His face was lined with the realization that his broad front had left the Allied line brittle and vulnerable to exactly this kind of concentrated punch. Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the impossible. Could he disengage his army from its current battle in the east, pivot 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the German flank? The room went silent because every officer present knew that standard military doctrine dictated weeks of planning for such a complex maneuver involving hundreds of thousands of men and vehicles on icy winter roads. But Patton did not hesitate, looking the Supreme Commander in the eye and declaring, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals laughed nervously, thinking it was bluster, But Patton was deadly serious because he had never stopped preparing for the war movement he knew was coming. While others had been debating defensive lines, Patton had secretly ordered his staff to draft contingency plans for this exact scenario, proving once again that he was fighting a different war than his peers. He knew that the lives of the 101st Airborne depended on a logistical miracle that defied every page of the Army field manual. By promising a 48-hour turnaround, Patton was essentially betting his entire reputation and the lives of nearly 250,000 men on the belief that speed was a better shield than armor plating. "The Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder," Patton growled, "and this time I've got hold of the handle," signaling a shift from victimhood to aggression that electrified the room. What followed was perhaps the greatest logistical feat of the Second World War, a movement so complex and rapid that German intelligence refused to believe it was happening until the shells started landing. Executing a 90-degree turn with an entire field army is akin to trying to turn a speeding freight train onto a sidetrack without slowing down. Just imagine the scene. Over 130,000 vehicles, from massive Sherman tanks to nimble Willys Jeeps, had to stop their eastward momentum, turn north, and navigate roads that were essentially sheets of black ice. On December 21st, the Third Army began its massive pivot, turning tens of thousands of vehicles onto roads that were little more than icy trails, driving through blinding snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures. Patton's staff officers, the unsung heroes of this logistical ballet, worked by flashlight in freezing tents, rerouting thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel in real time. Soldiers who had been asleep in their bedrolls in the Saar region were kicked awake, told to load up, and found themselves driving through a blizzard toward an unknown enemy within hours. There was no room for error. A single stalled truck on a narrow mountain pass could have halted an entire division, yet the Third Army moved with a synchronization that seemed almost supernatural. Patton himself was everywhere, his open command car weaving through the traffic jams, his face frozen and fierce as he urged his men forward, shouting, "Drive all night if you have to." He was the conductor of this violent orchestra, standing in the middle of frozen intersections, personally waving tanks forward, his presence acting as a high-voltage current that kept the men moving when their bodies screamed for rest. He was not commanding from a map room 50 miles behind the lines. He was in the weather, in the mud, sharing the misery and the urgency, embodying the sheer force of will required to turn the tide. On December 22nd, exactly 48 hours after making his promise, Patton's tanks smashed into the southern flank of the German offensive, catching the enemy completely off guard. The Germans, who had been focused solely on their drive toward Antwerp, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against a fresh American army that had seemingly materialized out of the snow. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the German armed forces, later admitted that they knew Patton was dangerous, but the speed of this maneuver was beyond their comprehension, a strike that could only have been delivered by old blood and guts. Yet the battle was far from won. Between Patton's spearheads and the surrounded 101st Airborne in Bastogne lay miles of fanatical German resistance and the cruelest winter weather in decades. Inside the perimeter of Bastogne, the situation was critical. The battered bastards of the 101st were low on ammunition, devoid of winter clothing, and surrounded by overwhelming enemy armor. When the German commander demanded their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back the immortal reply, "Nuts," a defiant rejection that rallied the defenders, but could not change the fact that they were running out of time. Patton pushed his men relentlessly, knowing that every hour of delay meant more American dead, forcing his tanks to fight through fortified villages and ambushes in conditions that froze machine guns and cracked engine blocks. On Christmas Eve, the fighting reached a crescendo of violence, with savage house-to-house combat erupting in the frozen towns leading to Bastogne, as the Germans threw their last reserves into stopping Patton's drive. Patton, exposing himself to artillery fire near the front, refused to seek shelter, telling his worried staff that he couldn't ask his men to do the impossible if he was sitting in a safe bunker. When Christmas Day dawned without a breakthrough and some officers suggested a pause to regroup, Patton exploded with a fury born of desperation, shouting, "We attack and we keep attacking until we break through, or I run out of soldiers." Finally, at 16:45 hours on December the 26th, the lead tank of the 4th Armored Division, battered and covered in ice, broke through the German encirclement and linked up with the defenders of Bastogne. The siege was broken, the trap was shattered, and the impossible had been achieved through the sheer, unyielding aggression of a general who refused to accept the limitations of reality. The relief of Bastogne was hailed as a miracle by the press and a tactical masterpiece by Eisenhower, who declared that only George could have pulled it off. But in the quiet of his headquarters, Patton took no joy in the victory, writing in his diary that they were being praised for cleaning up a mess that was created by the decision to stop in August. "We performed a miracle to fix a disaster that shouldn't have happened," he told his staff, haunted by the knowledge that the thousands of casualties suffered in the Bulge were the direct result of enemy time to recover. The Battle of the Bulge cost the United States over 89,000 casualties, a staggering butcher's bill for a crisis that Patton believed was entirely avoidable. As the winter faded and the Allied armies resumed their advance into Germany, the strategic debate seemed to settle, but Patton was determined to prove his point one last time. In March 1945, unleashed from the constraints of the broad front and given the fuel he needed, Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine and demonstrated exactly what could have happened 6 months earlier. Racing across Germany at speeds of up to 50 miles a day, Patton's forces collapsed the German defenses in weeks, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and tearing the heart out of the Reich with a speed that left Allied planners breathless. This campaign was the ultimate vindication, a real-world proof of concept that showed that when Patton was allowed to fight his way, with speed, violence, and momentum, the enemy crumbled. Years later, as historians sifted through the ruins of the Third Reich, the most damning evidence against the broad front strategy came from the very men Patton was fighting. The German generals who surrendered in the spring of 1945 confirmed Patton's darkest suspicions during their interrogations. During the Nuremberg trials and subsequent military interrogations, Manteuffel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt both admitted that the halt in August was the greatest gift Hitler received, stating unequivocally that if Patton had kept going in 1944, the Wehrmacht could not have stopped him. "We had no reserves," Manteuffel confessed to his captors, and if Patton had reached the Rhine, there was nothing between him and Berlin but open road and a few shattered police battalions. "The war would have ended in 1944, stated General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, confirming that the defensive lines that cost so many American lives in the winter were virtually unmanned in the late summer. Patton never recovered his relationship with Eisenhower, viewing the Supreme Commander's decision-making as a betrayal of military necessity in favor of coalition politics. In September 1945, he publicly stated that the war could have been won by Christmas '44, a comment that, combined with his other controversies, led to his relief from command. Patton's ghost continues to haunt the halls of military history because he understood a fundamental truth that his peers ignored. In war, the most expensive thing you can spend is time. And once you give the enemy a moment to breathe, they will use that breath to kill you. Tragically, the man who had survived the fiercest battles of the 20th century would not survive the peace. In December 1945, 1 year after his greatest triumph at the Bulge, George S. Patton died from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. He died believing that history would vindicate his aggressive philosophy, leaving behind a legacy that is still debated in war colleges around the world. 80 years later, the question remains, was Eisenhower's broad front strategy a necessary caution for a complex coalition? Or was it the costliest mistake of the war in Europe? The United States military has largely adopted Patton's doctrine in the decades since, favoring rapid, decisive strikes like the drive to Baghdad over slow, methodical advances, suggesting that in the end, old blood and guts won the argument, and that the refusal to take risks can lead to greater destruction in the long run. His legend endures not just because he won, but because he saw the path to victory when others saw only danger, and when the crisis came, he delivered the miracle that saved the day. Do you believe the war in Europe would have really ended by Christmas 1944? If Eisenhower had given Patton the fuel? Or was the broad front strategy the only safe choice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.